Without our involvement, changes happen without our consent.
Although there is critical knowledge present within these communities, Black Canadians have continued to be excluded and pushed out by racist systems and ideologies. What this has meant is that the folks who have the knowledge, ideas, and lived experience to effectively speak to and challenge the structural impacts of anti-Black racism are not being heard or utilized at the decision-making level.
We almost never discuss what non-formalized planning look like to communities, First Nations communities here, and then also within communities, specifically across the African continent, which the Black diaspora has its roots in. And there's a long history of processes of city building and decision making. And so it's really important to start having that level of conversation, I think, as well. That would really support an understanding how we as Black people and as displaced Black people really see ourselves in relation to place and space, and have done so historically.
A lot of the priorities in these communities, whether it's needs or interests and aspirations of communities, are often missing from the conversation, because what's best for communities, the idea of what's best for communities tends to come from the offices, from the ivory towers of planning. And that's deeply problematic, because folks have been doing planning for many, many generations, folks in the Black community. It just wasn't called that. It just wasn't recognized as that. But they've made do with the conditions that they were, placed in. And not only made do, but they've thrived and they've prospered. So it's really a disservice to planning professions to not tap into that knowledge and that wisdom.
Anti-Black racism in planning has also significantly impacted the ability of Black communities to generate fiscal and social generational wealth through the destruction and loss of community, both as a physical space and as a social net.
There aren't culturally specific services. When folks are displaced, oftentimes they still attempt to remain in close proximity to the area that they were in because there were services. But we also know a major part of displacement and gentrification as well, and those pressures is not just the displacement of residential components of a neighborhood, but it's also the services, it's the retail, it's the health services, it's all of that community build up over the years that folks organized around and met each other's needs through. And as I mentioned, if you're losing out on the services, if you're losing out on the retail, if you're losing out on health services, if you're losing out on child rearing supports, which you would find in community where there's familiarity components, then essentially you are losing out across a spectrum of wealth. So I don't want to just look at generational wealth as if it just comes down to the finances and the money in folks' bank accounts. But what we're seeing as a result of development pressures, we're seeing less and less of those established communities. And then therefore we're seeing less and less of the forms of community formation and supports.
And this contributes to serious impacts for the Black community through the loss of cultural services and spaces, affecting the goals and ambitions of these folks, as well as implications on the social well-being and mental health of the community members.
There's this looming sense of, being the folks who are going to be serially displaced. And that serial displacement is not just a myth or a boogeyman or anything like that. It's the reality of it. The story repeats itself over and over and over. And that's the most terrifying thing about it. People cannot dream about their future.
As a result of a sense of perpetual displacement, the Black community never really has a chance to catch their breath and actually build a community. We're more, at this point, a Black population than we are a Black community, and that's because the city is experiencing so many crises and constraints that by the time it trickles down to those who also experience anti-Black racism and the numerous other marginalizations, especially class and poverty, they're just going to feel it 10 times more.
One of the simplest actions to take towards building more equitable communities is through acknowledgement. Cultural enclaves, such as historically Black neighborhoods, provide space for residents to call home, community networks and support systems, and the ability for any and everyone to access and engage with a multitude of cultural offerings, one of the things we pride ourselves the most on in Canada. As such, it is critical that we preserve and support these incredibly important spaces.
Cultural communities like Little Jamaica are incredibly important to protect because they are a space where these diverse communities are able to more authentically express their cultural way of being and of relating to others in ways that you would not find in other neighborhoods. So, as a city, as a country, we consider ourselves to be a mosaic, and so we must protect the ability for people to have choice to live in spaces like Little Jamaica and not to erase that ability from our landscape.
There's all kinds of issues that happen when you feel like a foreigner in your own city. And so these places are so important. And you can read it from reports of folks. Like when I was doing work around Black communities in Toronto, people who were coming in the 50s and the 60s from the Caribbean talked about how important it was to have a West Indian grocer to go to have a place where your music was played, to have a place where you could celebrate with your culture. These are the things that let people feel grounded when they did that huge journey to come to this cold country that was thousands of miles away from where they grew up. So arrival communities, ethnocultural communities, they help everyone. They help to create bridges, if you think in the social capital sense, but they also help to create bonds. They help communities to connect to each other. And strong, resilient communities are communities that are able to economically contribute, are communities that are able to give back to the fullest length, and we all benefit from that. We've seen in so many examples what happens when certain communities are left behind. It actually is damaging for the fabric of our entire city.
So, now knowing all that we know, how can we as Canadians support and uplift Black communities in Canada? Well, the first step is to begin engaging in equitable conversations with these marginalized communities.
So community engagement is incredibly important, and that's because there's a lot of vital knowledge in these communities that have not been integrated into the formal planning process.
For the longest time, there has been this idea that there must be a level of expertise, that there must be a level of credentials before anyone can actually play a role in kind of crafting plans for neighborhoods, that local people just don't know enough about the systems or the technical details to make informed decisions, and they are resources that we collect data from, but then it must be experts who analyze and who then solve the problems or come up with an array of solutions based on what local people do. And I think what it's meant is all the blind spots, all the gaps in knowledge that those planners have, that those people making decisions have, fall into the plans that are created.
So when city planning started working in Little Jamaica, we asked communities, what should we be prioritizing and what can we do to support you in this planning process? And they told me that we want to do tenant organizing as part of the planning process because we have immediate needs that need to be met. And so that has been integrated into the planning process where now we're building these tenant associations, and now we have a network of folks and tenants, people who are most likely not to be engaged in planning, providing their feedback into questions like, what do you think is appropriate housing in your neighborhood? What levels of affordability? How tall? Things that they typically are not in the room to provide their feedback on.
You can ask them about how would you feel safe in your neighborhood? What is it in your neighborhood that is supporting people? Like, how do neighbors look out for each other? How do kids safely move through these buildings? And how do we take those insights and then put them into the design of our lobbies, into the design of the public amenities and spaces? When you do that, when people are coming together, you get actually communities that are not going to be perfect, but are much more likely to not have many of the pitfalls that generations of planning had, right? The housing projects that we see as being so deficient today, generations ago were seen as the best idea in the world. They were like these socialist worker utopias. We'd have these great courtyards where people would hang out. It didn't work out like that. But part of it was that was a generation of planners who didn't think for a moment to ask working class people, poor people, what they wanted to see in their communities. They thought they knew, they gave it to them, and then people had to live through the mistakes and the blind spots that those planners had.
We also must remember to think critically about the spaces and places in which we engage with community.
There's a tendency to want folks to come to us, and I mean us as government, instead of us going out into community. And there's a lot of barriers that come with that expectation. And also the locations that we choose to have, say, public information meetings. We often like to be in quote unquote central areas, in the downtown areas. And we're planning for communities without communities. We're planning for communities outside of communities.
When planners go out to do their work, when people do work around, thinking about our urban life, I think it has to be a prerequisite, it has to be a requirement that before you even start, you do an analysis, an equity analysis to think about who will be impacted by what we're doing and who is the most vulnerable here and who typically has the least amount of social power to influence these processes. My business partner Zara, she always talks about you move at the speed of trust. And sometimes, yes, it's important to be efficient, but if we're moving so quickly that we leave communities behind, that people don't understand what's happening, it actually comes back to us because then those folks are the ones pushing against it. They're protesting, they're angry, they're creating issues that slow down the development process. So especially at the beginning, taking the time to move with community, to really explain to people what is happening, why, where we want to hear their voice, and where there's opportunities for them to have real power and influence, actually leads to a more effective process overall, and not to mention one that actually lives up to that obligation to make sure those who are most impacted have a voice and a seat at the table.
Secondly, we can do so much more than just providing a listening ear. In order to fully support the Black community, resources, tools, and most importantly, decision-making power and agency need to be provided by our political leaders.
Planning bodies have the responsibility to invest in Black-led organizations who have been practicing care and supporting the economic and social well-being of Black people. These are the groups that are best positioned to actually build trust with, respond to, and carry out actions in support of these communities.
The onus falls on government as well to build the capacities of communities to be involved as active agents in these processes, because it's one thing just to say, hey, come to the table. But if they're not equipped to be able to be, equal partners in the activities at the table, then I don't think the outcomes will be beneficial for communities. So a lot of work needs to happen there to make sure that it's truly, truly beneficial and truly community-centric.
And there are many mechanisms which our planning bodies can utilize to empower Black communities by giving them the necessary supports to thrive. In regard to displacement and supporting tenants, one commonly practiced housing solution is the development of community land trusts, or CLTs. A CLT is a nonprofit corporation that holds land on behalf of a place-based community while serving as a long-term steward for affordable housing, community gardens, civic buildings, commercial spaces, and other community assets on behalf of a community. One recent example of this is with the Nora Hendricks Place modular housing development in Vancouver's Hogan's Alley neighborhood, a project led by the Hogan's Alley Society and in partnership with the City of Vancouver and the BC provincial government.
So right now, we're at 258 Union, which is where we have Nora Hendricks Place. And that's what this, what's coming to be a famous mural now on the side of Nora Hendricks Place is. And as you can see, we're right next to the viaducts as well, which was a big part in contributing to the displacement of the Black community. In 2019, BC Housing and the City of Vancouver came to the understanding that there were some immediate decisions that needed to be made to tackle the housing crisis, especially for unhoused populations, and temporary modular homes became that fix. And so Hogan's Alley Society, through the Northeast False Creek Plan, and the working group that was established, and specifically the section around redress, saw this as an opportunity to ensure that one of the temporary housing modules were committed to the Black community. And so that's how we ended up with Nora Hendricks Place. And what we have here is on the site where the community was displaced and in very close proximity to additional areas of displacement is we've got a 52-unit studio temporary modular housing site. 10% of the units on this site are accessible, and it meets the immediate needs of the most marginalized members of our community. This was a really great step in relation to the community land trust that we're looking to further develop, and the memorandum of understanding that we got to last year with the City of Vancouver. And so within that community land trust are the goals that we have to ensure that on this block we do see a residential component of development, but that we also see needs around childcare being met, a cultural center that continues to daylight and highlight the history of Black people, but also the present reality and what we understand today as Afrofuturism with regards to the Black diaspora and what that looks like in the city of Vancouver for Black people who are low income and across the spectrum of needs as well within our community.
Nora Hendricks Place is one example of the incredible housing work being pushed forward by Black Canadians throughout the country to support Black communities and redress for the historic and ongoing impacts of anti-Black racism. But there is still more work to be done, and with the right support, voices, and direction, we can truly work towards making more equitable Canadian cities.
I could say there's a story of hope. There's a story of, immense momentum right now with regards to planning in our Black communities.
The awareness raising is forever work, and the pointing to it is forever work, and the advocacy is going to be forever work out here.
We are seeing increased courage to say the word Black people, to talk about it in public policy, and I think we're moving to a paradigm that says local people are experts in things, including their own lives and their own neighborhoods. And someone who's lived in a community and walks it and breathes it every day actually has rich knowledge about what works and what doesn't work. And if we don't tap into that form of expertise, along with people who have a theoretical framework, then we're not going to see the blind spots that are there.
Redress for systemic anti-Black racism, limiting the ability for Black people to have access to good jobs, good housing, inadequate standard of living, and access to cultural services means to invest in Black-led organizations. We need the support to do the work that needs to be done. So donate, volunteer, do your best to support these organizations to thrive, because it's through their success that we can actually see anti-Black racism really conquered in our country.